This is a huge landmark voting bill, also known as House Resolution 1 and Senate Resolution 1. It's a bill in the United States Congress proposed by Representative John Sorbins, a Democrat of Maryland's 3rd Congressional District. And so he proposed it, and in fact, he actually proposed it in the 116th Congress on January 3rd, 2019, when the Democratic Party took back control of the United States House of Representatives. It's the first official legislation. The House passed the bill on March 8th on a party line vote. However, in 2019, with the Senate still under Republican control, then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell declined to give it floor time. In 2021, in the 117th Congress, Democrats introduced it as House and Senate Resolution 1. On March 3rd, the bill passed the U.S. House in a party line vote of 220 to 210. So if we look at the New York Times U.S. House 2020, let's just go there and double check the exact numbers. So the Democrats do control it, but there are 222 Democrats. And that means the Republicans did have a plus 12 net gain. That's something I will be talking about, but 220. So 2 Democrats did not vote for the bill. I forgot who it is, but there's some conservative Democrats who would be better off voting against. For example, Jared Golden of Maine's 2nd Congressional District, which voted for Donald Trump. He won re-election. So there are a lot of members who are from Trump areas, but they still won re-election. I mean, this district went for Trump, but he won by 6 points. It's a big thing. And back to the For the People Act. It's now in the U.S. Senate, which is split 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, and Kamala Harris holding the tiebreaker. I will get back to the rest of that soon, but let's just see what exactly is in it. So this is a huge thing. This is the biggest push for voting since 1960. You might have heard state that Georgia has just passed a controversial voting law, and there's some really controversial clauses. For example, there's one rule saying that you cannot give any food or water to anyone in the line to vote. It makes it illegal to do so. So if your grandma is waiting in the line for 8 hours to vote in DeKalb County, Georgia, a heavily minority, heavily black, heavily populated county in Georgia that heavily votes Democratic, and there's an 8-hour line because they removed lots of voting booths, removed a whole bunch of polls. You can't give them water. You need to pack a whole bag full of lunch and water and drinks. It seems it's a very polarizing issue, and Democrats have said they will use it in some of their ads for the 2022 midterms. So let's just see exactly what it is. So it has a variety of provisions. But firstly, the bill would set a national floor for ballot access. What this would mean is there's a basic amount of ballot access. So basically there's a minimum. Some states are already above it, and they're great. Colorado, Minnesota, and other Democratic states, and a few Republican states, including North Carolina, to some extent, are above this voting floor. However, some states like Texas and Tennessee are below this voting floor, and this legislation would make them change their rules to hit that level or go above it. This would only apply for federal elections, but looking at the amount of logistics involved, it would likely be implemented for state and local elections as well. Secondly, this measure makes it much easier to vote or to register to vote. They would be able to register, choose a party, join a party, and deregister online. 40 states and DC do offer this, but this would make every state offer it. They would also be automatically registered when visiting federal or state agencies, unless they explicitly decline, similar to what has been required of most states, but not always carried out by the motor voter law. This was a huge expansion in that year. In the last 2-3 year period, you saw a huge uptick in the number of voter registrations. Voters could also register when they cast their ballot on election day or in early voting. Early voting would be expanded nationwide, 15 days for 10 hours daily at least. Right, and so it's lesser than what's the average, but It would give a lot more access. And would also defang many voting restrictions imposed by Republicans, including the controversial Georgia law legislation passing through thousands of Republican state houses. In Texas, in Iowa, it's been signed into law. So many of them. Republicans' voter ID laws. And then after that, and this is a big one, voters would be notified at least a week before the election if the polling places have changed, and there would also be steps to reduce long lines, because that's what many Republicans have been done repeatedly in some of the more Democratic areas. For example, some polling places in the metropolitan Atlanta in Georgia were removed or decreased or moved around that led to long lines. This also tries to beat back rules that adopted by some states, including Texas and New Hampshire, that make it more difficult for college students to vote. Partisan gerrymandering would end. This is a big one. I will get to this later, but that's one more thing. And political contributions would be reined in. So right now there's PACs, political action committees, and there's super PACs, bigger versions, and they can donate a huge amount of corporate funding into campaigns, and there's no way to stop them. In the Supreme Court's controversial Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commission ruling in 2010, independent expenditures by corporations are forms of free speech protected by the Constitution. And that allowed non-profit groups, but more often special interest groups such as the National Rifle Association, to donate unlimited amount of money to any candidates to support or oppose them. In addition, this would also modify the Federal Elections Commission. Right now, it has 6 members, 3 being Republican and 3 being Democrat. You need 4 to get anything done, so most of the time there is gridlock. However, this would also modify this to include 5 members, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and an independent or a third-party individual, and the three members would be required to pass or take any action. It will also set up federal matching funds for Senate and presidential candidates. The money raised through fines on corporate lawbreakers and tax cheats would only be available to only candidates who reject political donations of more than $1,000. So this is a combination of many things, including the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It was introduced during the 116th Congress, which was till 2021, following the death of John Lewis. This has become a little saddening, but the legislation would restore and strengthen parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is a huge act that improved voting access for African Americans and other minority communities. It was signed into law during the height of the Civil Rights Movement by LBJ, President Lyndon B. Johnson. However, in 2013, the Supreme Court struck it in Shelby County v. Holder, because Section 5 includes a rule that certain states that have been known to draw their districts in a somewhat discriminatory way to give an advantage to a party. For example, states like North Carolina, which has done so, in fact, and got into a little trouble for it, and other southern states had to pre-clear any changes with the Department of Justice or the federal government before doing so. However, the Supreme Court struck it because it was unconstitutional. However, the Congress allowing it would change the view of that, and that is a huge thing for Democrats, because that would help to reduce voter discrimination in some of those places. Another part of it is the Fair Representation Act. While this is smaller, it does cover anti-gerrymandering. This bill has 3 main provisions. Not all of it is included, just basically the first part. So if you look at it, so 2 parts of it don't really make much sense to me, to be honest. Multi-member districts, because each district having at least 3 members, that would mean but it doesn't work because some states, like Delaware, for example, where the President Biden is from, only has 1 member, but there is some possibility to look into this, and ranked choice voting, which was implemented in some Senate elections, could also be implemented. However, the independent redistricting commissions would be established, and that has been implemented in the For the People Act. So if you look back at it, Congressman Sarbins. So if we look back at the For the People Act, according to Wikipedia, I checked this. This does cover that. There are independent redistricting commissions. There is some problems with that though. For example, who selects and appoints them? In Arizona and Colorado, which both have independent redistricting commissions now, there's been some controversy over who draws the lines. There have been controversies over whether the governors or the membership of them was fair and bipartisan. There are also two other things I'd like to talk about here. Gerrymandering. So this would thwart gerrymandering, except in the 7 states with only one congressional district. So those 7 states do not need any borders, and all legislation would like to have committee to have 15 members, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 Independents, and would require proposed maps to receive a majority vote to be accepted with at least one vote of a Democrat, a Republican, and an Independent. There's also quite a few criteria: population equality, Voting Rights Act, additional racial requirements, for example, respect for political subdivisions and communities of interest, and no advantage for any party. And lastly, this is a big one. I am making a video about this, but findings in support of DC statehood. It affirms Congress's power under Constitution's Article IV, Article 4, to create a new state in the area that is now DC. So that this is the whole proposal. It's called the Douglas Commonwealth Proposal. It was led by DC's non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes, among others, and it would create all of Washington, D.C. to be the Douglas Commonwealth, except of the White House, the Capitol complex, the Supreme Court, and the National Mall would just be a federal city or something like that. And the rest of it would be the Douglas Commonwealth. Removing those areas would reduce the population slightly, but it would give the Congress the power to do so. The House Resolution 51 would actually admit DC into the Union. They passed it in June 2020. Again, the Senate did not take it up, but the Democratic leadership are planning to bring it to the floor again. But now let's just look into DC statehood for a second. So DC has about 700,000 people. So if it was made a state, it would get representation because the Constitution states every state would have one representative in the U.S. House. But it would only get one because 710,000 is the number of on average. So DC gets one. What would that mean? Who would lose a seat? DC would also get 2 Senate seats, and that would give the Democrats an advantage because right now they have a 50-50 tie. So Joe Manchin is a huge vote because he can thwart many of Democrats' main goals and ideals. However, if the DC becomes a state, Democrats are almost guaranteed to win that seat, or both of those seats, and that would mean Democrats would have 52-50 instead of having a tiebreaker 51-51 in a 102 member Senate with DC included. They would have an outright majority. So even if Joe Manchin defects, Kamala Harris can tiebreak. That would give some Democrats some breathing room. But now, which states would lose a seat? Either the state of Alabama or the state of Minnesota, based on my research. Right now, if the state of Minnesota loses one, that is an interesting one because it's likely that either a Democrat would or a Democrat would lose the seat, but they would redistrict to make a Republican district more competitive. So that would mean they'd have maybe three Democrats, 3 Republicans, and a competitive district that changes hands often because Minnesota is a split government. But now, if Alabama loses a seat, that's an interesting one because although Republicans completely control Alabama, a Republican would likely lose their seat because the Democratic seat, Terry Sewell from Birmingham, is so heavily Democratic. Obviously, it could be redistricted, but that would mean they could crack or pack the districts. I do plan to make a video on gerrymandering, so stay tuned for that. But if they crack or pack the district, all districts might go Republican. However, if in a Democratic wave year, a vast majority of the districts could turn blue because Birmingham is included in them. So that's an interesting one. But that's all the For the People Act is, but it's a huge step forward for voting rights in the Democrats' view. However, in Republicans' view, it severely reduces election integrity. So right now, the Democrats have passed it in the House, but it's headed to the U.S. Senate. However, the Senate Republicans, who can block the bill from proceeding to a vote with a filibuster, and 60 votes are needed to stop a filibuster. Democrats only have 50, and if they abolish the filibuster or change the rules to allow voting rights to go through, they might be able to pass this. But to at least two Senate Democrats, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kirsten Sinema of Arizona, are both opposed to changing it. Interestingly enough, Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin's next election is in 2024, but Mark Kelly, the other senator from Arizona who has an election in 2022, supports getting rid of the filibuster. It's interesting, he's fading the voters first, but he's taking the more controversial position in Arizona. But that's all for today. Thank you for watching and please subscribe. Tane Politic videos every week.